Hi, I'm Mr. Wahlberg, and I'm glad you're here. As the war wound down in Europe, the eyes turned eastward towards the Pacific Theater, which, while the war would continue for a while, also meant perhaps the end of World War II is coming. Turn with us now to those thrilling days of yesteryear, when out of the past come the thundering hoofbeats of Wahlberg's A-Push. History class rides again! We have three objectives today. By the end of this class, you should be able to describe the course of the Second World War in the Pacific Theater. You should be able to explain President Truman's strategy for ending the war, and you should be able to explain how the end of the war shaped the post-war world. But let's begin in Roman numeral number 19. Here we see how the Allies worked on the Japanese Empire's threat rather than the Nazis' threat as we move towards the Pacific Theater. Because while the Allies agreed that the defeat of the Nazis was their first priority, the United States didn't actually want to wait until victory in Europe before moving against Japan. Fortunately, Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941 had missed the Pacific Fleet's submarines, and even more importantly, the attack had missed the fleet's aircraft carriers, which were actually out at sea at the time. The architect of the Allied strategy in the Pacific was Douglas MacArthur. He was too arrogant and prickly to be considered a regular guy by his troops, but he was arguably the most brilliant strategist of the Allied forces in World War II. For instance, for every American soldier killed in the campaigns, the Japanese lost 10. Subpoint B. In the first 6 months after Pearl Harbor, the Japanese conquered an empire that had dwarfed Hitler's Third Reich. On the Asian mainland, Japanese troops overran Hong Kong and French Indochina and Malaya and Burma and Thailand and much of China. They also swept south and east across the Pacific, conquering the Dutch East Indies and Guam and Wake Island and Solomon Islands and countless other outposts in the ocean, including 2 islands actually in the Aleutian chain of Alaska. In the Philippines, around 80,000 American and Filipino troops were battling the Japanese for control. By the time of the Japanese invasion in December of 1941, General Douglas MacArthur was in command of Allied forces on the islands. When American and Filipino forces found themselves with their backs against the wall to Bataan, President Roosevelt ordered MacArthur to leave. And on March 11, 1942, MacArthur left the Philippines with his wife and his son and his staff. As he left, he pledged to the many thousands of men who did not make it out, "I shall return." Subpoint C. Here let's look towards the Battle of the Coral Sea, because the main Allied forces in the Pacific were the Americans and the Australians, whom I don't think get enough credit for their work in World War II. In May of 1942, they succeeded in stopping the Japanese drive towards Australia at the Battle of the Coral Sea. During this battle, the fighting was done by airplanes launched from enormous aircraft carriers. In fact, not a single shot was fired by a surface ship. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, though, the Japanese invasion had been turned around at the Battle of the Coral Sea. In subpoint D, let's look to the Battle of Midway, because that was the next thrust of the Japanese Empire's attack, a strategic island lying northwest of Hawaii, where, again, the Allies succeeded in stopping the Japanese advance. You see, Americans had broken the Japanese codes being transmitted back and forth and knew that Midway was going to be their next target of capture. So on June 3rd of 1942, U.S. scout planes found the fleet of the Empire of Japan, and the Americans sent torpedo planes and dive bombers to the attack, catching the Japanese with their planes on the decks of their carriers. The results were devastating. By the end of the Battle of Midway, Japan had lost 4 aircraft carriers, a cruiser, and 250 planes. In the words of a Japanese official, at Midway, the Americans had avenged Pearl Harbor. The Battle of Midway was also a turning point in the Pacific War. After that, Allies began a new strategy called island hopping, capturing some islands and leaving others entirely untouched as they began to hop across the Pacific to go win territory back from the Empire. Subpoint E. The first Allied offensive began in August of 1942, when 19,000 troops stormed Guadalcanal and the Solomon Islands. By the time the Japanese abandoned Guadalcanal 6 months later, they called it the Island of Death. Guadalcanal marked Japan's first defeat on land, but not its last. Americans continued moving towards the main islands of Japan. In October of 1944, 178,000 Allied troops and 738 ships converged on Leyte Island in the Philippines. General MacArthur, who had left the Philippines 2 years earlier, waded ashore and announced, "People of the Philippines, I have returned." Subpoint F. The Japanese sent their entire fleet into the Battle of Leyte Gulf. They also tested a new tactic, the kamikaze, a suicide plane in which Japanese pilots crash-bombed their their bomb-laden planes into Allied ships. Kamikaze means divine wind, and it refers to a legendary typhoon that saved Japan in 1281 by destroying a Mongol invasion. In the Philippines, 424 kamikaze pilots embarked on suicide missions, sinking 16 ships and damaging another 80. Despite the kamikazes, the Battle of Leyte Gulf was a disaster for Japan. In 3 days of battle, it lost 3 battleships and 4 aircraft carriers and 13 cruisers and almost 500 planes. And from then on, the Japanese Imperial Navy really played only a pretty minor role. Subpoint G. After taking much of the Philippines and liberating the American prisoners of war there, the Allies turned to Iwo Jima, an island that the writer William Manchester later described as an ugly, smelly glob of cold lava squatting in a surly ocean. Sounds nice. Iwo Jima, which actually means Sulphur Island in Japanese, was critical to the United States as a base from which heavily loaded bombers might reach Japan. It was also perhaps the most heavily defended spot on Earth, with 20,700 Japanese troops entrenched in the tunnels and caves which totally permeated Iwo Jima. More than 6,000 U.S. Marines died taking this desolate island. It was the greatest number of any battle in the Pacific to this point. Only 200 Japanese troops survived. Subpoint H. By then, though, only one obstacle stood between the Allies and a final assault on Japan itself, the island of Okinawa, which U.S. Marines invaded in April of 1945. The Japanese unleashed over 1,900 kamikaze attacks on the Allies during the Okinawa campaign, sinking 30 ships and damaging more than 300 ships, killing almost 5,000 sailors. Once ashore, the Allies faced even fiercer opposition than they faced on Iwo Jima. By the time the fighting ended on June 21, 1945, more than 7,600 Americans had died. But the Japanese Empire paid an even ghastlier price. 110,000 lives were given by the Japanese Empire to go defend Okinawa. The Battle for Okinawa was a chilling foretaste of what the Allies imagined that an invasion of Japan's home islands might be. Churchill predicted that the cost would be 1 million American lives and maybe half that number of British lives. Roman numeral number 20. Taking Iwo Jima and Okinawa opened the way for an invasion of Japan itself. Japan has 4 main islands and about 1,000 smaller islands that surround it. However, the Allied leaders knew that any such invasion would become a desperate struggle. Japan still had a huge army, and it would defend every inch of their homeland, and the emperor had pledged to fight until the last man. Scientists offered a different plan, though. They'd learned that atoms had a tremendous amount of energy if they could be split, meaning that atomic energy could create a bomb stronger than any bomb ever seen on Earth. The Manhattan Project was a research development undertaking during World War II that produced the first nuclear weapons. Developing the atomic bomb wasn't only the most ambitious scientific enterprise in history, it was also the best kept secret of the war. Nuclear physicist J. Robert Oppenheimer was the director of the Los Alamos laboratory that designed the actual bombs. The project was called Manhattan because that's where the Army engineers were. They were at least where they were originally located, and because its official name, the development of substitute materials, might draw attention. Manhattan Project didn't sound like anything. The project grew to employ more than 130,000 people and cost nearly $2 billion US dollars. And that's $2 billion in 1945 dollars, around 27 billion in our modern dollars. In July of 1945, the first successful nuclear test was held in Alamogordo, New Mexico. In an empty expanse of desert, a blinding flash, visible for 180 miles, was followed by a deafening roar as a tremendous shockwave rolled across the desert. Subpoint B. Truman didn't know anything about this plan until after he became president, but after considering the weight of large-scale explosions, he decided that it was still preferable to an invasion of Japan. On July 25, 1945, he ordered the military to make final plans for dropping 2 atomic bombs on Japanese targets. A day later, the United States warned Japan that it faced prompt and utter destruction unless it surrendered at once. Japan refused. Subpoint C. So on August 6th, the B-29 bomber named the Enola Gay released an atomic bomb, codenamed Little Boy, over Hiroshima, a middle-sized Japanese city with an important Japanese military base. 43 seconds later, almost every building in the city had collapsed into dust from the force of the blast. One minute, Hiroshima was a middle-sized city. The next minute, Hiroshima ceased to exist. A 4-mile area was entirely flattened. 70,000 people were killed instantly. Another 70,000 people were injured. Several hundred thousands would die later, diseased with nuclear fallout and radiation poisoning. Japan struggled to understand the scope of the bomb, and they doubted the United States' claim that they had more of these kinds of explosives ready. The war proceeded as Japan continued to fight with its conventional warfare. 3 days later, a second bomb, codenamed Fat Man, was dropped on Nagasaki, there leveling half the city. Somewhat larger, its scope of damage was less because of the way the hillsides contained the explosion. Still, 40,000 people were instantly killed. By the end of the year, an estimated 200,000 people had died as results of radiation poisoning caused by those atomic blasts. Subpoint D. Army Chief Staff General George Marshall arranged to have a third bomb ready in a couple of weeks, and others at various stages of completion. He issued strict orders that only the president could authorize their use. Emperor Hirohito was horrified by the destruction wrought by the bomb. He said, "I cannot bear to see my innocent people suffer any longer." That's what he told Japanese leaders tearfully. He ordered them to draw up papers to end the war. On September 2nd, General George MacArthur accepted the Japanese surrender aboard the USS battleship USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. Roman numeral number 21. Even as the war raged, a series of meetings between Allied leaders formulated plans for the post-war world. First in Tehran in Iran in 1943, where the big three of Stalin, FDR, and Churchill formed their alliance. Then in Yalta, Crimea, where the three planned how Europe would be reorganized after the war to ensure collective security and to give self-determination to people in post-Nazi Europe. And lastly in Potsdam in Soviet-occupied Germany in 1945. The group had changed. It was attended by Truman instead of FDR, and Clement Attlee replaced Churchill. The only consistent piece there was Stalin, which, consistent. Potsdam decided that peace treaty issues and made the plans for rebuilding Europe. Subpoint B. Besides geographic decision, Germany also had another price to pay for its part in the war. The discovery of Hitler's death camps led the Allies to put 24 surviving Nazi leaders on trial for crimes against humanity, crimes against peace, and war crimes. The trials were held in the southern German town of Nuremberg. At the Nuremberg trials, the defendants included Hitler's most trusted party officials, the government ministers, military leaders, and powerful industrialists. In the end, 12 of the 24 defendants were sentenced to death, and most of the rest were sent to prison. In later trials, more than 200 Nazis were found guilty of war crimes. Still, many people have argued the trials didn't go far enough in seeking out and punishing war criminals. Many Nazis who took place in the Holocaust went free. Yet, no matter how imperfect the trials were, they established an important principle that individuals are responsible for their own actions, even in times of war. Nazi executioners couldn't escape punishment by claiming that they were merely following orders. The principle of individual responsibility was now firmly entrenched into international law. By the way, this still exists today. No person can say, I did something wrong because someone else told me to. Your conscience is always your responsibility. Subpoint C. While Japan was occupied by U.S. forces under the direction of General Douglas MacArthur, in the early days of that occupation, more than 1,100 Japanese, from former Prime Minister Hideki Tojo down to lowly prison guards, they were arrested and put on trial. 7 of them, including Tojo, were sentenced to death. In the Philippines, in China, and in other Asian battlegrounds, additional Japanese officials were tried for atrocities against civilians or for prisoners of war. During the 7 years of the American occupation, MacArthur reshaped Japan's economy by introducing free market practices that led to a remarkable economic recovery. MacArthur also worked to transform Japan's government. He called for a new constitution that would provide for women's suffrage and guarantee basic freedoms. In the United States, Americans followed these changes with interest. The New York Times reported that General MacArthur has swept away an autocratic regime by a warrior god and installed in its place a democratic government presided over by a very human emperor and based on the will of the people as expressed in free elections. The Japanese apparently agreed. To this day, their constitution is known as the MacArthur Constitution. Subpoint D. By mid-1944, China, the Soviet Union, Britain, and the United States met at the Dumbarton Oaks Park near Washington, D.C. to discuss a new League of Nations, the United Nations. There, they decided that all member countries would have an equal voice in the General Assembly, but there would also be a smaller council that would be chiefly responsible for maintaining the peace. This smaller group would have 11, now 15 members, charged with international peace, accepting new members, and approving any changes to the UN Charter. 5 countries, the United States, the Soviet Union, now the Russian Federation, the Republic of China. Originally, it was Taiwan, but that was replaced by the People's Republic of China, or what we think of today as China, but also Great Britain and France. Those 5 would be permanent members of this Security Council, while other seats would be rotated among the rest of the Assembly. The 5 permanent seats would also have veto power over any UN resolution. This is somewhat undemocratic, but it represented the major world powers at the end of the war. This question of how to keep peace in a post-war world, what the changing alliances, the changing relationships between countries that fought against each other or fought on the side of each other in World War I will be the story that will shape the rest of this class, and it's a fascinating story that I can't wait to tell you about. Make sure you like and subscribe. God bless you.